What made you believe that that would be the future of transit?
For me, transportation was never just about getting from point A to B. No, it was part of the story, part of the experience. I've always believed that how people move through space shapes how they feel in that space.
So what exactly was Walt designing? It was EPCOT, but not the one that you see in Orlando today. You see, his idea for EPCOT was something more like a utopian futuristic city where there's no crime, there's no traffic, all the modern problems with cities today are just completely solved. So in this video, I have a very special guest. I've used AI to imagine a conversation with Walt Disney. Now, this video and this character don't claim to represent Walt Disney or to speak on his behalf. I decided to, instead of using a real deepfake and taking actual footage of Walt and making him speak realistic, I decided to make a more stylized, drawing type character, just to actually distance it from the real person. So, with that being said, here is to a very interesting conversation with a very interesting guest. Please welcome Walt Disney. Here with our AI Walt Disney. Walt, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Hi, Kareem. It's good to be here.
Hi, perfect. So I want to start with your last planned project, which is EPCOT. As we know, it's the one that we have today is not the one that you were planning on. You had conceptualized EPCOT as this sort of city of tomorrow, futuristic. So could you go over what were you trying to do? What were you planning? Please go over that.
But like you said, it was meant to be a city of tomorrow. The grand idea, you see, is that there are a lot of vices that the architect Victor Gruen said contributed to the so-called anti-city. So our goal was simple: fix the noise, the pollution, and the endless traffic jams you see in cities today. So, for example, we wanted to keep automobile traffic to a minimum. So the plan was such that cars and trucks would move underground, while an elevated public transport system would carry people around the city. And then special highways would connect the neighborhoods directly to the outside world, so that this way the town itself could stay peaceful and clean. Then we also wanted to show to the world the power of American free enterprise. You see, companies would be constantly introducing new technologies directly into the homes of our residents, which would keep EPCOT in essentially a permanent state of innovation. The actual layout was something like a wheel, a radial pattern, with business and commerce right at the center. Surrounding that, there'd be high-density housing. Beyond that, a green belt for recreation. And further out, quiet residential neighborhoods. Imagine a city that is truly livable, a true joy to live in, while also having a relentless drive of innovation.
All right, and that's obviously not the EPCOT that we have today, which is a theme park in the Walt Disney World Resort. So what do you actually think about the EPCOT we have now? What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I do have to thank Roy for continuing the dream in some way and creating something that so many people love. I don't dismiss his work, nor the work of the people that made EPCOT Center. But here's the thing. When I set out to build EPCOT, I really wanted to create something that does more than entertain, but something that revolutionizes, something that people could point to and say, look, that's an example to follow. Had that succeeded, I think we would be living in a much cleaner, happier, and better world. So while I do appreciate and commend Roy on his extraordinary effort, and I think that he's succeeded in creating something wonderful, but at the same time, I do think that solving the problems of our cities is what we needed.
I see what you mean there. Well, yeah, Disney never actually built the city EPCOT, but they did actually build a community. It's the town of Celebration in Florida. So Celebration, it was built with this movement called New Urbanism. They wanted to solve the problem of suburban sprawl. So, those giant stretches of highways and cookie cutter neighborhoods where you have to drive just to get a gallon of milk. The new urbanists, they didn't want to bring community back, town centers with real things to do in them, everything accessible. And so they also have these kinds of rules where every house has to have a balcony or a porch or something of that sort to promote this quote unquote neighboring, to try to make it a community. But as thoughtful as that is, obviously it doesn't even compare to the scale of EPCOT's plans. I mean, we're talking about a just massive project here. So, well, could you go over, please, what was your thinking here? What was it like planning such a, just mammoth-sized endeavor?
One of the last things I did at the company, I sat down and sketched out a version of the EPCOT master plan myself. Now, Normally, I left the drawing to the team, brilliant folks like Marvin Davis, but this time felt different. I wanted to leave something behind, something people could look at and say, that was Walt's vision. You see, I'd learned something from Disneyland. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm proud of that place. But when we built it out in Anaheim, we didn't buy enough land, you know. We couldn't control what went up around it. So pretty soon you had cheap motels, neon signs, a second-rate Las Vegas right outside the gates. So this time we did it differently. In Florida, we secured over 27,000 acres. That's not a theme park, that's a canvas. And with that much land, we could plan everything, a city, an airport, an industrial park, even space for a community of workers and families. It wasn't about just building attractions, it was about building a better environment, a better way to live. Now, Marvin drew up 69 different site plans for Disneyland before we signed off on the final one. He wasn't a fan of Las Vegas either. Neither of us liked the sprawl, the randomness, the noise. That's why EPCOT had to be different. And if you look at that sketch, my sketch, you'll see more than just the Magic Kingdom or hotels. You'll see a jet airport, a monorail line stretching the full property, even a swamp ride. But at the heart of it was EPCOT, the experimental prototype community of tomorrow, a blueprint. That plot plan, well, it became the foundation for Walt Disney World. They changed it, sure, modified it, but the core, it's still there. And I hope people understand we weren't just trying to entertain. We were trying to build something that lasts.
You know, what's really striking about all this is that a lot of what you were talking about here, like fixing traffic congestion or fixing sprawl, like these are still problems in city planning today. And today we hear talk about things like, 15-minute cities or climate adaptive infrastructure. But it seems like people right now are just finally starting to catch up to what EPCOT was aiming for back in the 60s. So I want to take a look at how exactly we can fix the dysfunction of modern cities. And I think there's two main things here. It's really how we live in cities, the layout of the city, and how we move through them. And I don't want to start with the latter. So, Walt, could you please tell us about transportation and what the plans for transport at EPCOT were going to be like?
I've always had a thing for transportation. Even as a kid, I loved trains, the motion, the rhythm of them. Later, when I built my own model railroad in the backyard, it wasn't just a hobby. It was the beginning of a whole new way of thinking. In a way, that little backyard train, well, it became the spine of Disneyland. Now, when we added the monorail in, 59, I really started thinking about the future of transit, not just in the parks, but in real cities. The highways were getting bigger, the automobiles louder, the air dirty and polluted. Now, I love the automobile as much as anybody, but it was clear it had taken over our cities. It pushed people to the margins, and now streets weren't for walking anymore, they were for surviving traffic. So that's where EPCOT came in. I wanted to prove that we could build a city where people came first, where transit worked for you instead of against you. So the entire transportation system was carefully layered. Underneath the city, trucks would move goods quietly out of sight. And a level above that, but still underground, cars could access the downtown, but only to park. They'd never touch the surface streets. I always said I wasn't against the automobile. I just believed it had crept too far into our lives. Cities didn't need to be hostile. They could be clean, quiet, walkable. Kids could get to school without crossing busy roads. Families could live near beauty and progress at the same time. And up top, above ground, there was the good stuff. The monorail for long-distance trips and the Wedway people mover for short hops around the city. Right in the middle of it all was the transportation lobby, our version of a train station for the future. Monorails would glide in from the industrial parks and satellite communities, and people movers would fan out like spokes from the center. No rush hour, no gridlock, just motion. Clean, electric, constant. Now, some of these ideas weren't new exactly. Planners in Stockholm or places like Radburn, New Jersey, they'd been working on separating pedestrians and cars. Victor Gruen had done it in Fort Worth, and Le Corbusier, too. But EPCOT wasn't just a theory. We wanted to show the world how it's done. We had the land, we had the tech, and we had the will. And maybe, just maybe, if we got EPCOT right, we could show the rest of the country, and maybe even the world, how to do it better. Not just for fun, not just for fantasy, but for real.
Underground highways for cars. That's a really incredible proposition, although I can imagine the engineering behind that. Now, the closest we actually got in Walt Disney World to that is the Utilidors at Magic Kingdom, which I mean, obviously those are crucial for the actual operation of the park, but let's be honest, that's really underwhelming compared to underground highways, which you were planning. Um, but I think you bring up a good point about cars. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. They just take up so much space. I mean, there's especially when it's just one person in a car, like one person in a metal box. It's just completely wasted space. There's even like entire subreddits dedicated to just hating on cars, which I know you weren't exactly doing, but I mean, I think that some of these statistics are just wild. Like I'm read here that apparently America has around 2 billion 2 billion parking spots, 2 billion spots, 2 billion. And so that is apparently enough space for something like 600 million one-bedroom apartments. I think like that's insane. So Walt, I'm curious, like for you, why exactly do you think that monorails were the answer? What made you believe that like that would be the future of transit?
For me, transportation was never just about getting from point A to B. No, it was part of the story, part of the experience. I've always believed that how people move through space shapes how they feel in that space. And honestly, that belief really started with trains. When I added the monorail to Disneyland back in '59, that wasn't just some flashy ride. That was a prototype, a test run. We were experimenting, refining, seeing how something like that could actually work in the real world. And sure enough, it did. By '66, we'd already carried over 22 million people on that monorail. Now, that's a lot of test data, if you ask me.
Okay, and how exactly did the monorail get into Disneyland?
Oh, we had sent some of our top people, Joe Fowler and Roger Bragi, all the way to Germany to study something called the Auweg system. And they came back with the real deal electric trains running on a single reinforced concrete beam, the essence of the monorail. So we got it up and running in Anaheim. First one in America to cross a public street, actually. The beamway itself had over 6 miles of wiring, and those old Mark I trains, they could hit speeds over 80 miles per hour. That wasn't just entertainment, that was infrastructure. Now, unfortunately, no one took our example. Outside our berm, highways and automobiles were still king. We even had officials from LA come inspect our system. They looked and they nodded, and then they went back to building more freeways. But I kept saying, there's a better way. Cities don't have to be parking lots with buildings squeezed in.
Did you show this anywhere else? Because, I mean, let's be honest, California is not exactly known for solving urban problems.
One thing people don't always realize is just how much we learn from World's Fairs. Before the New York World's Fair in '64, I actually sent a lot of our WED staff up to the Seattle Fair in '62. And they were running an Auweg monorail system there, same technology we were using in Disneyland. And I wanted our team to really study it in action. Now, I tried to get a full-scale monorail built for the New York Fair, too. I spent quite a bit of time talking with Robert Moses, the guy in charge of that fair. We had some real back and forth about transit. I wanted a system that connected all the pavilions and recreation areas, something futuristic, efficient, and honestly, something that felt inspiring. But he went with buses instead. Cheaper, easier. You know the drill. That whole rail versus bus debate. It's still going on today. But for me, separating people from the noise and hassle of road traffic just made sense, especially if you're building the future.
So when it came to EPCOT, you wanted to essentially prove that like mass transit could really work. Is that right?
Exactly. EPCOT was supposed to show it, not just talk about it. We designed it so that monorails would handle the long hauls, like from the industrial parks or airport into the city center. And then once you were inside the city, the people mover took over, moving people in and out of neighborhoods, shops, schools, constantly in motion, no delays.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people would agree that would love to see more monorails out there in the real world. And it's kind of a shame that we don't have as many in cities because, I mean, they look cool, they save you space, you get great views from them, but I think the real problem here, though, is cost. And, like, there's a good reason why people don't build them. Essentially, in order to build them, they always have to be elevated, which gets expensive really fast. And also, in order to, let's say you want to change the direction of the track, compared with a regular rail where you just flip the switch. With a monorail, you have to physically move the entire track, which gets let's say, pricey and dangerous very fast. I mean, I was over here on the engineering subreddit, and there was a comment that really stuck out to me, and I think they explained this perfectly well. The guy said something like light rail on an existing street is just way more practical because you can add a bridge or a tunnel if you really need to, and the trains, they run on standard steel wheels that barely needed maintenance. And plus, the whole thing uses existing tech, so nothing too exotic or expensive to keep up with. So yeah, like while monorails are cool, there's a good reason why cities don't build them. But you also mentioned another mode of transport, the people mover, and I think that a lot of times today people just know the people mover as like that chill ride in Magic Kingdom, but according to what you're saying, this was going to be an actual mode of transportation. Is that right? Like for real cities to use?
You know, by the time we started working on EPCOT, I'd spent a lot of time just walking through cities, observing, listening, and honestly, they were a mess. Cars everywhere, streets choked with traffic, horns blaring, fumes rising, people just rushing and dodging like rats in a maze. It didn't feel human anymore. We built these cities around machines instead of people, and we were paying the price. Now, what I kept thinking was there's got to be a better way to move folks around. Of course, I wasn't the only one asking that. One gentleman I knew, James Rouse, while he was designing new towns like Columbia, Maryland, and he came up with the idea of little minibuses that would pick people up every 5 minutes and take them wherever they needed to go. It was clever, and it worked. But it still relied on the roadways, on rubber tires, on crossing paths with pedestrians. And I thought, what if we could go even further? You know, that thought really took hold when we were preparing for the New York World's Fair in the early 60s. Before that, I'd sent a bunch of my team over to the Seattle World's Fair in 62. And they came back buzzing about that monorail system built by Alweg. Like I said, it was sleek. It was quiet, you know, it was elevated above the traffic. You could see the city glide by beneath your feet. Now, we didn't build a monorail at Seattle, but at the New York Fair, we did build something else. A system of moving platforms at the Ford Pavilion. Real Ford cars, Lincolns, in fact. They glided past scenes of dinosaurs and inventions, and all thanks to these rubber wheels embedded in the track. That's where the first version of the People Mover was born. Right there underneath the polished chrome of a show car. And now that, that started something big. I started dreaming up a new kind of transportation for EPCOT. You know, one that didn't require roads or traffic lights. One where no kid would ever need to cross a street to get to school. It was a system that was always ready, never late and never loud. So that's how the People Mover came to be. We had designed it as the intra-city backbone of EPCOT. So what the monorail was to regional travel, the People Mover would be for neighborhoods. It would begin in an underground lobby at the heart of town, right beneath the hotel, in fact. And from there, it would rise up and radiate outward, passing through office buildings and high-rise apartments, the Greenbelt, and into the quiet residential streets. And you didn't need a steering wheel. You didn't even need to wait. Now, the Disneyland version, which we built in 1967, was a working prototype. It was, 62 little trains, each made up of 4 cars. Silent, electric, and always moving. And they ran on rubber wheels built into the track, so if one unit needed servicing, it wouldn't stop the others. No breakdowns, no traffic jams. We even had a moving sidewalk, the speed ramp, that would gently lift people up to the station. The doors opened automatically. It only needed a handful of staff to operate. You know, I used to say, I want a car there within 3 minutes. And by design, the People Mover made that happen. It was elegant, it was efficient, and most of all, it was kind to people. Why, you could glide from your home to the office, or to a cafe, or out to the park, and never once have to touch a car door or hear an engine roar. And that was the dream. So when folks ask me what made EPCOT different, I tell them it wasn't just the buildings or the tech or even the ideas. A lot of it was the way everything moved. Gracefully, quietly, always forward. You know, just like progress ought to.
Yeah, I think that's incredible. And honestly, I want everybody who ever goes to Magic Kingdom and rides the People Mover, let's say, I don't know, you're just resting after a long day in Tomorrowland, or you just wanted to take a break, I want you to remember what was just said. I mean, you're not just riding an attraction, you're gliding along a prototype, a real solution that was supposed to shape how we move through cities and revolutionize transport. But Walt, I also want to talk a little bit about James Roos, who you had previously mentioned, because this whole idea of solving the problems of cities and building a new utopian cities from the ground up, that wasn't something new. People had tried this before. And James Roos, like you, was a businessman who tried to create a community. So I want to talk a little bit about, or I want you to explain a little bit how James Roos's project of Columbia, Maryland influenced EPCOT, and how are they going to be different, and maybe what similarities do they have?
Ah, yes, James Rouse. Now there's a man who understood the heart of community. Back when I was deep into planning EPCOT, I had actually toured some East Coast developments with James and our wives, and we spent about 3 days visiting these places, swapping ideas, sketching, talking late into the evening. There was this sense that we were all trying to do something better than the sprawl we kept seeing pop up all over America. Now, Rouse had a bold plan for Columbia, 10 satellite villages orbiting a central downtown with space for about 100,000 residents. But now here's the thing. It wasn't just about buildings or roads. It was about people. His 4 goals really said it all. Respect the land, build a real city, not just another suburb, and help people grow as individuals and families. And yes, turn a profit so the model could sustain itself. And if you ask me, it's that third one, the personal growth that really sticks. You see, Rouse wasn't just planning streets. He was trying to plan lives, places where people could come together, connect, and thrive. And so his designs followed that Radburn tradition. You see, you'd have these little clusters of homes grouped around some shared green spaces, schools and meeting halls. No big busy boulevards cutting people off. Instead, it was cul-de-sacs, footpaths, open lakes, and even communal mailboxes, all to bring people together. I remember him saying something about how even the mail could be a chance to spark a conversation. And what really moved me was that Columbia was built with diversity in mind from the start. Rouse wanted folks of different backgrounds and income levels living together, not apart. That's something we both felt strongly about. Communities should lift everyone. Now, my aim with EPCOT, well, it wasn't exactly the same. You see, I had my eyes set on American industry. I wanted to work directly with companies to keep the city in a state of constant progress. So that's new tech rolling out right into people's homes, not only showcasing it at fairs, but letting people live with it, test it, benefit from it. So Columbia and EPCOT both wanted to fix what was broken in suburbia. And oh, let me tell you, we both believed in something better, something bigger. And maybe, just maybe, the world's still catching up.
What really stands out to me in all of this is that you weren't just thinking about one piece of the puzzle. You really had the entire big picture in mind. Because, a lot of developers, they'll just focus on the tech side, or they'll just focus on building a good community. But you were dreaming of doing both. And so you had this city where you had all these technological innovations, you had these gadgets flowing into people's apartments, ready for them to try out and use. But yet that community was still there. You still had like these connected communities, and kids could safely walk to school. So honestly, I'd love to hear more about the heart of the city, EPCOT. What was the town center going to be like? What did you plan there? Maybe what inspired you?
Well, the heart of EPCOT, we planned all the essential buildings, much like the town centers we're all familiar with. So there would be a shopping district themed around different countries like Swiss, German, even Chinese, to celebrate global culture. And then surrounding that, you'd find a greenbelt, high-density apartments, single-family homes, and neighborhood centers. We also included everything a real community would need. So picture restaurants, a fire station, a library, theaters, banks, a hospital, a television studio, and of course, plenty of office space. Now, right in the middle, there was to be a 30-story convention center, what I like to call a weenie. It's a sort of landmark, something that pulls your eye and gives the whole place a focal point. What always troubled me was how so many cities have become very loud and polluted, overcrowded places where people felt isolated. So I wanted to change that. And I wasn't alone either. All across the 20th century, there were visionaries trying to solve the same problems, and my team and I studied them closely. So when we started laying out the physical plans for EPCOT, we weren't just pulling ideas out of thin air. No, we were building on the work of people who'd been thinking deeply and seriously about how cities ought to be designed. Now, one book that really stuck with me was Victor Gruen's The Heart of Our Cities. You see, Gruen, he was more than just a mall architect. He had this grand vision for a metropolis of tomorrow. And I tell you, it was one of the few things I read that felt as ambitious and as human as what we were trying to do. And so Gruen had this idea of building cities out of these little clusters, kind of like cells in a living organism. So you start with a neighborhood that's about 900 folks, and then that grows into a community, which is 5 of those neighborhoods working together. Then 4 of those make a town, and so on until you've got a whole metropolis that is 10 towns strong, and each layer had its own center, places to gather, work, relax, and the transportation system he dreamed up, well, it wasn't just cars everywhere. He thought in terms of air travel, high-speed trains between cities, and electric transit between towns. In his plan, freeways were kept on the edges where they belonged. And so that kind of thinking, layered, dynamic, and people first, that's what helped us shape EPCOT. Now, of course, Gruen wasn't alone. This way of planning, what they called organic planning, it went all the way back to a gentleman named Ebenezer Howard and his garden cities. There were also folks like Patrick Geddes, Olmsted, even ecologists like Arthur Glickson. They saw the city as similar to a living thing, something that could heal and grow if you treated it right.
You know, I think that's a really interesting way to look at it, looking at a city as like a living organism and something that can grow and prosper if given the right nourishment, because like it's just like how like in your bloodstream you can't have a traffic jam there. Same way you can't expect a city that's sick and dysfunctional on the inside to grow and prosper, right? And so I think that's an interesting paradigm shift that opens up a lot of different ideas of how we see cities. But you mentioned Sir Ebenezer Howard and his garden cities, which garden cities, those are essentially these small, green, self-contained communities that are linked through transit. So was this also an inspiration to you?
Oh, sure. I read Howard's Garden Cities of Tomorrow, and I thought it had some real merit. You see, what he was trying to do, blending the best parts of town and country, giving folks the charm of a small village with the opportunity and industry of a city, that's something that stuck with me. And his circular layout with the garden and civic buildings at the center and the green belt around it, even the rail-linked offshoots, it was thoughtful. Letchworth, his first real garden city, had that sort of medieval charm that I've always liked. And more than anything, Howard was thinking ahead, not just in architecture, but also in how people live together. That's what EPCOT was about, too. Planning not just for efficiency, but for community. There were many intellectuals we had looked to. Believe it or not, some of our ideas were even predicted by Leonardo da Vinci. He once sketched out a system of 10 cities, each one limited in size and designed with separate spaces for pedestrians and carts, even underground roads. You know, just like those underground highways in EPCOT. His drawings had that same circular radiating design we used. So yes, we drew from many sources, both modern and classical. EPCOT was meant to be the next chapter in that story.
So, Walt, I want to ask, were there any existing communities that like you truly thought were a great example to follow and that, you know, did a city proper justice?
Oh, certainly I had visited many around the country. I was very fond of Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, which I visited in 40 and 48.
Hey, is that the village that Henry Ford built?
Yes, that was Ford's town. You know, there are so many iconic pieces there, like Thomas Edison's Menlo Park and Florida Laboratories, or pieces of the Wright brothers' Kitty Hawk Flyer. In fact, even early tabulation equipment. It's a place that truly brings the past to life while celebrating progress. And we also look to the French-Swiss architect Le Corbusier, one of the great urban thinkers of the 20th century. And so he had this plan called the Plan Voisin. You see, in Paris at the time, there were enormous problems with economic segregation, where the upper class moved to suburbs and the bourgeois stayed in the city center. And then other less fortunate folks were forced into the outskirts, some of which turned into slums. And you see, his solution was to build these skyscrapers that were really spread out. And the secret to getting this to work was the skyscrapers were comprehensive, so people could live and work in them. Too bad Paris rejected his plan, saying it was far too radical.
Yeah, and I wonder what they would have thought of EPCOT if they thought that was ambitious. But, you know, it just goes to show that at that time there were so many people, so many thinkers and planners just throwing everything they could and that they had against this problem of our cities and trying to find solutions to traffic and whatnot. You know, when we think about the 60s, I think a lot of us, we think about the space race, or we think about the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, and this war on cities is a little bit less well known, but it was a big part of the 60s. But now, Walt, there is one thing that I'm thinking, and I think a lot of other people have the exact same question, like, how on earth was this going to be financed? Because, I mean, the EPCOT Center that opened in 1982, that had pavilions sponsored by a lot of different companies like AT&T, General Motors. later on even entire nations sponsoring their national pavilions. But your original plan for Epcot, I mean, we're talking about like what, 2 underground highway systems, 30-story convention center, an entire climate-controlled dome, like a real functioning city with monorails and people movers. So, like, how is this going to be funded?
Oh, well, of course we didn't expect to do it alone. We had built strong relationships with a lot of companies, American Motors, Kodak, Kaiser Aluminum, Monsanto, just to name a few. You know, these were folks who had already partnered with us at Disneyland and the World's Fair. But for Epcot, we took it even further. I sent General Joe Potter, one of our top people from the New York World's Fair, to knock on doors at over 100 companies, places like IBM, AT&T, DuPont, or even U.S. Steel and Bell Labs. Now, he came to me once and said, "Walt, how am I supposed to get in to talk to these guys?" And I told him, "Just say Walt sent you." And you know what? He was never turned down, not once. In fact, he even got into their experimental labs. And that told me one thing, that they were listening.
Did you ever think about merging with one of those big corporations, just to get the whole thing off the ground?
Oh, we did consider it. General Electric even proposed a merger. But I turned it down, not because I didn't need the support, but because I was afraid they'd take it in a direction I didn't believe in. You know, Epcot wasn't supposed to be a corporate theme park. It was supposed to be a working prototype of the future. Now, I'll admit, I did eventually agree to build another theme park, the Magic Kingdom, even though I didn't want to just repeat Anaheim. But Roy and I agreed, if we could get 8 to 12 million guests through those gates, it would give us the leverage to attract serious industry and investors for the rest of the Florida project. And we also looked to public support. So our team put together proposals for HUD. That's the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And in 1968, the Florida governor told Roy they were ready to support us if the budget allowed through a partnership with private enterprise. And then there were banks. Why, I had a good relationship with Bank of America going all the way back to the 1930s. They believed in us back when Disneyland sounded crazy. And I think they would have believed again with Epcot. You know, Disneyland proved it could be done. Epcot was just the next step.
Okay, yeah. In the end, like, we don't know exactly what the total required investment would have been for Epcot had it been built. We know that the Epcot Center that opened in 1982 had a price tag of about 1.5 billion US dollars, and so adjusted for inflation, that's about 4.5 billion today. It was actually the largest construction project on Earth at its time. Now, obviously, well, I know that you wanted to see the revolutionary city built, but let's imagine for a second that Epcot was just something on the side of that city, like the Epcot that we got. Imagine it was just like a theme park that we got on the side, an addition, an augmentation to Walt Disney World. It incorporated a lot of things from what you had planned, like those shopping malls that ended up becoming World Showcase. So, for example, what do you think about these international pavilions that did actually end up getting built?
I think they're beautiful. Each pavilion is like a little window into a different culture, and the architecture, the music, the food, it all helps people feel a little more connected to the wider world. That was always part of the vision. You see, the original idea for the International Shopping District was actually inspired in part by the shopping arcades of Europe.
Yeah, and earlier we were talking about Gruen and his Petal Cities design, but I think Gruen is much more well known as the inventor of shopping malls, which at that time that was a really cool idea, that instead of going to a loud and hot village market, you could go into this nice, air-conditioned, sleek, multi-story complex and just find all the shops that you want there. So was this, at that time, new idea of shopping malls an inspiration for those international shopping districts that you had planned?
They were somewhat inspired by the shopping mall, but in a more communal manner. You see, I had visited new shopping centers in places such as Rochester and Philadelphia, but in the Epcot concept, I had decided against indoor shopping spaces because I much preferred naturally lit environments, and the entire center was to be encased in a climate-controlled dome, which would negate any need for further encapsulation.
Yeah, Walt, about that dome, I have to ask you about that, the one that was supposed to enclose the entire town center of Epcot. This is where some people start to say that the project really got a bit outlandish, and they said this was just a piece of sci-fi fantasy. I mean, was this really feasible to build a giant dome over a city?
Ah, the dome. Yeah, I've heard the laughs and the confusion, but believe me, it wasn't just for show. No, we were solving a real problem. You see, Florida's got a subtropical climate, about 50 inches of rain a year, in fact, and storms that roll in like clockwork, and the occasional frost that can wipe out greenery overnight. A dome would have protected the entire heart of the city.
Yeah, right, and that would have helped with air quality too, right?
Exactly. Since all the vehicles inside would have been electric, the dome wouldn't trap emissions. And with that kind of control over the environment, well, we could simplify construction and skip the storm drains and focus on comfort. We weren't the first to think about it either. Buckminster Fuller had plans for a dome over Manhattan, and long before that, you had things like the Crystal Palace in the 19th century. Even H.G. Wells dreamed of dome cities back in the 1890s.
But wasn't there any pushback from the fire safety side of things?
Sure. Tom Moses from the Reedy Creek District brought that up. And yeah, it would have been a challenge. But we weren't locked into one exact design. The idea was to explore what was possible. Even in the Progress City model at Disneyland, you can see skylights and open-air elements. Natural light was something I always preferred. And the dome was about creating a space that felt reassuring, futuristic, and alive, not sterile or artificial.
Okay, so definitely not a sci-fi stunt. This was actually going to be a real solution, but I guess just one that needed more time and technology to really pull off.
Exactly. We were reaching, and that's what EPCOT was all about.
Okay, well, we've been talking quite a bit about ideas, blueprints, and bold visions, but I want to talk a little bit about what you actually did build. And I think that one thing that we can start with is the 1964 to 1965 New York World's Fair, because not only did that inspire EPCOT, a lot of the most iconic Disney attractions, like It's a Small World and the Carousel of Progress, those got their start there. So, well, I want to ask you, because I see a lot of the same that went into EPCOT, that like the boldness, the innovation, the trying to give a glimpse of the future to people. A lot of it was there at that fair. So, Walt, what exactly? Can you tell us a little bit more about how this fair, like what went into the New York World's Fair?
Yes, absolutely. A lot of the groundwork came from our experience at the New York World's Fair. We had 4 pavilions there, each one a testing ground for ideas we'd later carry into EPCOT. Take the Ford Wonder Rotunda, the largest pavilion at the fair. It had this 10-story dome, and guests would glide through it on a kind of super skyway, looking down over a futuristic city with towering spires and shimmering glass domes. It was a bold visual expression of the world to come. Then there was Progressland, sponsored by General Electric. That's where we introduced the Carousel of Progress. It used lifelike animated human figures to show how electricity transformed everyday life across the decades. You can still see that show at Magic Kingdom today. We also had It's a Small World, created with Pepsi-Cola and UNICEF. It was a celebration of global unity through music and design. And of course, the great moments with Mr. Lincoln Show, which demonstrated how far we'd come in audio animatronics. But you know, one of my favorites was actually from Disneyland, the Monsanto House of the Future. That was a collaboration with MIT's Departments of Architecture and Engineering. You see, we wanted to imagine how people might live in 1986. So everything, the kitchen, the bedrooms, even the core layout was built with cutting-edge materials, especially plastics reinforced with fiberglass. We experimented with a lot of ideas. A sink that adjusted for kids, early microwave cooking, ultrasonic dishwashing, even a video phone, long before that was reality. It was all about anticipating the future as something people could actually live with.
I want to also talk a little bit about the construction of Disneyland itself. We remember James Roos before from the planning of Columbia, Maryland, but he made a very controversial and bold statement once at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he said that he believes that the best piece of urban design and planning in the United States is Disneyland, because he said that its performance in relationship to its purpose, it really took the amusement park, something that people knew about, and lifted it to such a high standard that it became like its own new thing. He says that he sees more to see or to learn in the ideas and visions that were set and done by Disneyland than in any other piece of physical development in the country, which is a really bold statement to say at to such a educated and distinguished audience. So, Walt, I want to ask you, I've personally only been to Magic Kingdom, which is largely an iteration of Disneyland, and I agree, it's like a fun place for families to go. It's thematically cohesive, pleasant. Um, so, were there any amusement parks at your time that really inspired you and that you learned from?
Actually, I would say, well, I was so upset by their state that I thought something unlike them would benefit the American family. You see, at the time, amusement parks were often dirty, tacky scams. For instance, I had visited Coney Island with Lillian and told her after that I was almost ready to give up the idea of an amusement park after seeing it. The whole place just seemed so run down and ugly. The people running it were so unpleasant. It really showed me just how much potential there was to do better.
Okay, yeah, and for context, so back when Disneyland was being dreamed up, amusement parks in America were still, let's say, finding their shape. You had places like Coney Island or the World's Fairs, or even places like Central Park were starting to take shape. Let me see here. Walt, I know that you visited the 1939 New York's World's Fair, and your father, it looks like he even worked at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Um, when it came to Disneyland, besides making sure that guests had a great experience, did you use any kind of like techniques or any kind of like inventive ideas to really bring that like theme into the park and that like old town American theme?
Oh, absolutely. One of the key techniques we used was forced perspective. Take Main Street, USA. So the first floor is built at about 90% scale, and the second floor drops to about 80%. And so that trick makes the buildings feel taller and more charming than they actually are. It exaggerates vertical space as one looks north toward Sleeping Beauty's castle. But it wasn't just architecture, it was the colors, the signage, the little details, what I called the architecture of reassurance. I personally reviewed every single graphic and visual element that went into the park. Why? Because I wanted guests to feel like they'd stepped into a storybook version of home. Safe, inviting and familiar. You see, I wasn't just designing for children. I was designing for the child in all of us. Disneyland had to feel human-scaled, no cars, no chaos, just a place where you could stroll, explore, and feel oriented. That's why we built the hub and spoke layout with the castle at the center, a compass that always lets you know where you are.
Yeah, and it looks like a lot of those techniques are still in use today. Like, for example, Galaxy's Edge uses that a lot in order to create that, like, Star Wars-like environment and that, large, grandiose scale of things while still keeping things the size that they're supposed to be in a theme park. Now, Walt, we talked about how EPCOT was supposed to be much bigger than it actually ended up being. With Disneyland, was that also the case? Was it supposed to be something much bigger that got scaled down?
No, in fact, it started out much smaller. The original idea was something I called Mickey Mouse Park. I came up with it after a visit to the Chicago Railroad Fair with Ward Kimball. The concept was a quaint little town built around a village green and a train station. It would have had a town hall, a post office, a small opera house, even fire and police stations with real scaled-down equipment. I imagined families sitting on benches in the shade and kids playing by a bandstand or getting candy from an old-fashioned sweet shop. We planned a hobby store, a toy store, and even a little horse-drawn streetcar for those who didn't want to walk. And then a western village with a general store, a lunch counter, even a pony ring, and a stagecoach ride through a small farm and Indian village. At the very end, a donkey pack train, just one man guiding a string of donkeys for the kids to ride. It was all simple, all very personal. A place where people could feel like they'd stepped back in time, not to escape the future, but to remember what made us feel connected in the first place.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of those early lands, they ended up becoming some of the different like lands that we find in your theme parks. Like, for example, that Western Village sounds a lot like Frontierland, or that town concept clearly evolved into what we see today as Main Street USA. So, like, how exactly did these things evolve over time, and how did you change them into what we actually got?
Well, originally the areas I imagine weren't lands in the way we think of them today. It was more like one continuous, interconnected town, small, walkable, thematically consistent. Everything flowed together naturally. You weren't hopping from one fantasy to the next. It was more like turning the corner in a real place. At one point, we even considered building it right across from our studio in Burbank on a parcel of land along Riverside Drive. The idea was to include a full studio backlot, theater stages, television sets, technical equipment, so guests could actually see how our shows were made. At that time, most major studios had working backlots, but we weren't doing live-action films yet, and the animation building didn't exactly screen tourist attraction. In fact, in 1953, Roy took a trip to New York to pitch 3 themed production facilities. One was the Opera House on Town Square for the Disneyland TV series. Another was Treasure Island in Frontierland for the Mickey Mouse Club. And a third was Tomorrowland, meant to anchor our World of Tomorrow show. But even in those early studio-based ideas, there was always going to be a town center, a main street. I wanted that train station, that quiet American downtown, and even a small residential district. It was designed to echo a real journey. You'd arrive by train, step into town, walk through the heart of a community. That's how people traveled for most of the early 20th century, and I wanted to capture that feeling, the moment where the world slows down and welcomes you in.
Yeah, and I think that's really what makes the experience. It's all about that journey and being transported into another place, or like another world, if you will. Well, I just want to say that this conversation itself has been an incredible journey. Hearing you speak your thoughts, your passions, your plans, it really just goes to show that EPCOT was never meant to be just a place. In a way, it was supposed to be a message, or like a challenge even. It wasn't just about predicting the future, it was about really building it. And while the EPCOT that we got today may not be the one that you dreamed of, I personally think that your legacy is still there in the optimism, in the creativity, the imagination, and really in that belief that we can shape a better future if we just dare to imagine one.
And I'd say also this: progress isn't just about gadgets or grandeur, it's also about people. A future worth building is one where folks can walk down the street, look up at a clean sky, and feel like they belong to something bigger. A community that's thriving, growing, and unafraid to try. EPCOT was never just my dream. It was also an invitation to create bold change. So if there's a calling in you to make things better, don't wait for permission. Go out there, grab it, build it.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much, Walt, for the dreams, the doing, and the reminder that the future is always under construction.
My pleasure.
Hey everyone, hope you've enjoyed listening to this imagined conversation with Walt Disney using AI. A lot of the information for this episode was done with Walt Disney's own writings, his public statements, and a lot of it was with the book Walt Disney and the Quest for Community by Steve Mannheim. While Walt never got to see the city EPCOT as he envisioned it, I think that a lot of the questions and the themes that he brought up involving technology, involving community, how we live with each other, these are all just as relevant now as they were before. So thank you so much for listening.